Good morning to you all and welcome to this seminar of the SEMENTÄ project. To me it's a pleasure, it's an honor to be able to participate and to contribute to with my brief presentation. First of all, I'm going to introduce María Reimóndez. I am sure you know her already. She's the promoter of this project about feminist translation. Maria has a PhD in translation and interpretation. She works as a translator, as an interpreter, but she's also a writer, and she's also very well known as an activist. As you might know, we're going to speak about the SEMENTÄ project today, and Maria is the promoter of this project, and she is the main promoter and participant. This project is a project about feminist translation amongst non-hegemonic languages. It is also very interesting in terms of research. In my opinion, I believe it's an honor to participate in this project, to be able to collaborate with this project, because I am an activist of the Galician language. And I believe this is very good for our language to be able to conduct this research about feminist translation in Galician, and not only from a linguistic viewpoint, but also as a feminist. It is also interesting because we can have more resources for activists and on the basis of non-hegemonic languages. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to María Reimóndez. She's going to make a presentation. And some feminist writers have been chosen for this project from the Haitian Creole, Tagalog, and Tamil. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce María Reimóndez. Hello, good morning. I guess you can hear me. So good morning, good afternoon, depending on where we are. Bonjour, Banakam, Mahandangavi. So once again, we meet again within the framework of the SEMENTÄ project. So first of all, I'd like to thank all the participants and Iria Taibo as well for being with us today. So once the first seminar is over, now we're going to focus on feminist translation within the SEMENTÄ project. And for those that did not attend the first session, even though it is on YouTube, and you can access it in French and English, first of all, I'd like to remind you what SEMENTÄ is. As Iria said, it is a project of feminist translation amongst non-hegemonic languages. It has a dual goal. On the one hand, to research into those projects of feminist translation, getting involved activists, thinkers, and translators, as we did in the first seminar as well, and a selection of text, and then to create a repository of feminist texts. And once we have those texts, we will discuss today, of non-hegemonic languages into Galician. This project is my initiative, and it has been funded by the project Bodies in Transit and by the Jacobean 21-22. And it was awarded the Luisa Villalta Award from the Diputación da Coruña. SEMENTÄ, as we already discussed, but we're going to say that again, is a word that includes the concept of that seed that flows into the air and finds a ground to be able to grow. And it is a way to understand feminist translation as a way to grow and to disseminate knowledge. Those A and E that are joined together at the end represent the trans-inclusivity of women and non-binary identities, but also the noun seed is also the potential of SEMENTÄ. It's also an imperative that encourages us to continue with that work. As we said, SEMENTÄ has 2 stages. The first one was already finalized, that first seminar to share the potential texts in these 3 languages that are presented here as well. As I said, this seminar is also accessible on YouTube if you want to watch it again, if you could not attend at that time. And now we are in the second stage. Translators themselves are working with the different selected texts from their original languages to an intermediate language, and they're going to discuss that today. Later on, we will publish the translations of those texts into Galician. Some of them will be uploaded on the website of our project, SEMENTÄ, which you can see on the screen. So my role today, in addition to do this small reminder, to give you this framework, is to introduce a more global vision of what we understand for feminist translation, because I think this is not self-obvious. Within this project, we refer to feminist translation, but I think it's necessary to say what we mean by that. So feminist translation is a theoretical and practical trend that has been circulating for quite some time. In the case of Galicia, actually, we have a feminist translator in the 19th century, Rosalía de Castro, who applied the strategies that are considered revolutionary today. But in theoretical terms, it was developed in the Western world, on which I will focus in this presentation, as a revision of all the theoretical framework, the traditional concepts applied in the translation world. In the West, it's usual to speak about the author as a male entity, and a female translator has to praise him and to show some servility. And the theoreticians of feminist translation have analyzed this construct, and it is connected with a patriarchal Western vision of power. And the author is somebody to which a female translator has to be loyal, and this comes from a biblical vision. The translation of the Bible is highly related to the ideas of hegemony of Christendom, of the patriarchal power of Christendom. In addition to this revision, this is just an example of many concepts and metaphors that are used in what we call the traditional translation theory. But feminist translators, as researchers, pay attention to what is translated, who is translated, and what for. And for the most part, what is translated in the field of literature and thought are works written by men, so there's a dual invisibility for texts written by women, especially if they write in non-hegemonic languages. And analysis has been made about the presence of women in the labor market of translation and interpretation, and this crossroads with other matters, the language you speak, race, etc. So why is this general thought important? Because not only from a feminist viewpoint, from a decolonial viewpoint, it's important to think about the tradition of thought. This is the main topic of SEMENTÄ. So there are certain ways to know the world, certain epistemologies that are considered as universal, and others are considered as secondary. So there are many concepts of power, and within the feminist thought, these structures are also reproduced, because according to the feminist theory, we find many Western female authors, so there are many practical experiences in the world that are not considered. So feminist translation will only make sense if it is made by analyzing different epistemologies, trying to contribute to a more polyphonic space and not just a transfer of Western texts to other places. Texts written in hegemonic languages for other places that are considered as a canon of feminist readings. So SEMENTÄ wishes to turn this concept or this power structure around. There is an aspect that is especially important, and it is connected with our seminar today. What happens with the text written from feminisms in translation? So the analysis is not only about the texts that are being produced, but how they are being translated. I will not go into these examples, but in the case of literature translated into Galician, we have many examples and many others in other hegemonic languages in which the text written by feminist writers, especially those that deal with race or colonialism, undergo much violence when they are translated. They can become more masculine. Some important references are removed to be able to understand the critical framework where they were written. And you might remember that not long ago there was a controversy about the translation by Amanda Gorman, a black U.S. poet, and she established a number of conditions to be able to hire the translators of her works, and the publishing houses in some places of the planet in the Western world didn't want to comply with that. So this gesture of Amanda Gorman wished to make visible this violence against the texts of the blind women, even though they are part of the literary U.S. system. So it is very important to take these translation strategies into account. So who are the feminist translators within that context? So in my case, I've been researching into that. I've been developing some theory and practice about this matter. I believe there are some elements which are crucial to determine whether a translator is feminist or not. So, well, we all know about the general characteristics, the understanding of other languages that everyone that deals with translation needs to have. But it is important to know that to be a feminist translators, and you do not only apply this when you're translating text from other families, but in general, you need to take into account many issues that are connected with power. We need to be aware and responsible of our choices and how those choices contribute or not to the inequalities in some places, and especially when we are specifically working, as in the case of SEMENTÄ, in context of other feminist translators. So it is important to know the feminist movements in the two cultural settings we are working with. We need to understand very well the linguistic usages and also different concepts or other matters that might require some intervention so that communication can take place. And so those epistemologies that are more polyphonic that I mentioned before can go ahead. So this is the base for feminist translation, and this is also the base for translation at SEMENTÄ, with some specificities, because as I said at the beginning, SEMENTÄ strives for communication amongst non-hegemonic languages. Sometimes we don't have direct translations between both languages, so we need to use an intermediate translation and to use hegemonic languages for our own benefit. So it is important to understand that the texts that are going to be translated by our colleagues in different hegemonic languages will not be read in those languages. They are texts that will be used by other feminist translators for translation purposes. So contextualization is important to help other translations. It is very important to do without the myth of fluid reading. This text will not be disseminated for a general international audience. The goal is to establish a dialogue with other translators. In this sense, these interventions are quite peculiar, and I am sure that the speakers will discuss this in detail later on. And just to finish, I'd like to give you an example that could be applied in the translation from Galician to hegemonic language. So I use the word nation that I am sure will appear in many of the feminist texts there are in Galician language, because it's a very important question for us. But it is important to think that this word has different connotations in hegemonic languages versus our languages, because usually in hegemonic languages, when you speak about a nation, you speak about the construct state-nation. So there is unification between the state and the nation. In many non-hegemonic languages, at least in European ones, nation is not used the same way. It is a word that defines the autonomy of a people to decide upon their own fate independently from the states in many cases. In the colonized countries that were colonized by different European states, we know that the word nation has different usages. So it is very important not to take this for granted. A word might seem very transparent, but it has different values in different texts. So the feminist translators need to conduct research about that and to make this explicit so our colleagues can translate the text into their own languages. So without further ado, I'd like to share this idea. Feminist translation is always an act of personal and collective responsibility when we translate texts of other feminist translators or any other text. So in that sense, SEMENTÄ wishes to contribute to this responsibility, personal and collective responsibility, establishing networks of support. So now I give the floor to our colleagues, and they will have the chance to tell us about how to materialize everything I have said. So now I give the floor back to Iria. Thank you very much. A very interesting presentation, as Maria said. So now we're going to listen to our three colleagues, and they're going to discuss the difficulties they are running into. And so first of all, Daryl Leyesa will take the floor, and she began to become aware of feminism by means of rural feminists who taught her about the independence between the economic and the gender justice, the right to have a voice and to be heard, empowerment and equality. Daryl is a political and agrarian activist, and she's convinced that you can claim for rights better from this kind of organizations. She has participated in several projects. She was one of the promoters of the first National Conference of Rural Women in 2003. She is involved in different campaigns about environmental security and climate justice. So now I give the floor to Daryl.
Thank you, Iria, for that introduction, and greetings of solidarity for everyone in this conference, and to my fellow translators, Laura and Caridad. Good luck to us. And of course to Maria, the one who is cultivating SEMENTÄ right now. Warm hugs from the Philippines. So again, good day everyone, and thanks again for this opportunity to share my translation journey. So I refer to it as a journey, really. I have shared last September that the Filipino text I've chosen is entitled The Babaylan in the Feminist Consciousness. Babaylan is spelled as Babaylan. And the author of this essay is Professor Fe Benaventura Mangahas. She's a retired professor of history in St. Scholastica's College, Manila, and has served as a council member of the National Historical Commission here in the Philippines. The essay was first read in 2015 and then revised for the forum convened about the Babaylan feminism on August 29, 2017, in the UP Diliman, University of the Philippines, Diliman. Again, I'm very thankful to Professor Fe Mangahas for agreeing to be part of this process. I mentioned last time too that choosing this text or this essay for the SEMENTÄ platform comes from the motivation of looking at our common history, our common past of where women have experienced violence and oppression. And secondly, It is also a celebration of women's contribution to liberation and freedoms in specific moments of our histories. So to proceed, or just to share the experience, I would like to read the first translated paragraphs of the text, mainly because I'd like for every one of us here to really imagine who the Babaylans are. With your indulgence, I'm reading the introductory part. So here goes. The Babaylan in the Feminist Consciousness by Professor Fe Benaventura Mangahas. I first heard of the word Babaylan in 1987. I was intrigued by what one speaker said in a conference about women's role in Philippine history that was sponsored by the University of the Philippines Center for Women's Studies. The speaker, Dous Salazar, said that all the conference papers came from the perspective of feminism and therefore are Western or just imported from United States and Europe. He claimed that these were not rooted to Babaylanismo, the indigenous consciousness of the ancestors of women in the Philippines. Some of the feminists reacted during that conference. They reasoned that feminism is part of the concrete realities of the current times. The root of Babaylanismo is not there anymore, and if there remains, it is weak and couldn't respond to the current problems of the Filipino women. They said that the current theories of liberal feminism, Marxist feminism, radical feminism, and I also add postmodern feminism, are enough to explain and give solution to the women's problems in the current context. This is a timely invitation for me to share my initial studies on the fate of the Babaylan during the 1896 revolution, the revolution that sought to end the 300 years of Spanish colonization and American occupation from 1898 to 1930. Is the Babaylanism tradition gone, or has it died in the consciousness of our women today? Or has the Babaylan consciousness evolved? There is a need to review briefly who is the Babaylan in its indigenous meaning and in their faith in our history. The review of who are the Babaylan. The original context of the Babaylan is very important. In the social order during primitive communal times, there were 4 recognized leaders or pillars in society who managed the order, welfare, and comfort of the communities. First is the Datu, who managed the livelihood and natural resources of the community. The Datu implemented the laws, acted as judge to conflicts, and coordinated internal and external concerns of the community. Second is the Panday, who were known as the blacksmiths or makers of weapons, boats, houses, and tools for the farms, homes, rituals, and many more. Third is the Bagani, who were the warriors, protectors, or soldiers. Their role was to take care of the peace and defend the communities from enemies. Fourth is the Babaylan, who possessed more knowledge about the environment, culture, and faith. The role of the Babaylan was to preserve the community as a whole, and for this reason, the Babaylan was a spiritual leader, healer, storyteller, advisor, peacemaker, visionary, or able to foretell the future. In the perspective of our ancestors, the world is composed of 3 levels or dimensions. First, the heavens of God the Creator, along with the deities and spirits. Second, people, land, territory, and nature. And third, underneath the earth where evil and dark creatures live. They believe that there's a need to recognize the infinite power of the Creator as represented by the sun, where all lives on earth come from. They needed to respect and must not anger the deities and spirits protecting nature. Even the evil spirits that roam around should be avoided and pacified through rituals and by offering food and prayers. During earthquakes or typhoons, the communities also offered rituals. They had rituals to drive away bad spirits that cause illnesses. There were rituals for weddings, pregnancy, giving birth, for planting, harvesting, fishing, or even before going into battle. All these were meant to request protection and care from the Creator with the help of the deities and spirits. The Babaylan was the primary person to officiate the ceremonies for all the cited rituals because the Babaylan had the capacity to communicate with the Creator and the deities and spirits. With knowledge of the world, galaxy or stars, domain of people and nature in this planet, it was only the babaylan that could solve problems that were beyond the powers of the three other leaders. For example, the babaylan would know that what herbal medicines were best to cure certain illnesses. The babaylan would know if the illness was merely physical pain or perhaps has something to do with emotional or psychological causes. The babaylan had deep understanding of the act of nature, and for this reason, the babaylan was also consulted on when to start cultivating, harvesting, fishing, or going into battle. The community had enormous trust on the rituals officiated by the babaylan, especially in asking protection from epidemic, earthquake, typhoons, and when faced by spirits or enemies. The rituals for Thanksgiving and celebrations also brought joy to the community. Many of the babaylan were women and seldom men. For them to carry out those roles, they needed knowledge about medicine, rituals, and spiritual awareness. This shows the important role of women in the indigenous communities. Therefore, the woman as babaylan had equal power or maybe greater than the power of the other three leaders, Datu, Panday, and Bagani, because her role penetrated through the three levels of the world, the upper, middle, lower. She exercised in a broad space her roles as a spiritual leader, healer, or epic chanter, advisor, peacemaker, etc. She was not just in the homes, farms, or spiritual places. Rather, the whole community is an open space for her. I will stop there, and I would like to invite you to ponder on the last sentences because I find those sentences really very interesting. Quote, she exercised in a broad space her roles, unquote. The key word here is space. Quote, she was not just in the homes, unquote, again, saying she's not just confined in particular spaces. Quote, rather, the whole community is an open space for her, unquote. This means that there is no public-private divide in her role and freedom to exercise those roles. I consider this as very interesting because if we could remember at the start of the essay, it was argued by some feminists that the babaylan feminism is far from the problems of the women today. Yet in one description about the spaces that were open to the babaylan, one could really see its relevance to understanding the gendered notion of spaces that we have now, such as the domestication of women, restrictions to women in the productive space, silencing of women in political spaces. So the open spaces to the babaylan symbolize the freedom of indigenous women prior to the colonization. When we were colonized in 1521 with the landing of Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese merchant under the service of the Spanish monarchy, such space was literally conquered. So just to continue with some of the translated text in the middle part of the essay, Professor Mangahas wrote in paragraph 12, in the Philippines, the babaylans were the biggest obstacle to the reducción, or the establishments of pueblo or villages and Christianization. They continued to oppose the teachings of the friars and did not follow the prohibition against their activities. The friars hated them and launched false accusations, black propaganda on them, calling them witches, bad and evil women, and the likes. So I stop there again. Again, the babaylans were among the first to fight for freedom and for territory. As I reflect on this text, it excites me to think how readers in non-hegemonic languages would also ponder on perhaps similar episodes in their history, like the Inquisition and witch hunting against those that the church hierarchies deemed as heresy. So the context of spaces and colonialism and its impact on gender roles is just one of the interesting aspects in this essay. On a lighter note, I'd like to share as well some technical aspects or questions in the translation process that I would love to hear feedback on from my sisters here in SEMENTÄ. Well, one is the challenge of translating the word babaylan itself. It is a proper noun, and apart from the comprehensive description already provided in the essay, I was wondering if there's a need to provide annotations still on the word itself. For instance, where in the Philippines have it been observed to be largely used then and until now? Where did the word originate? So the next question then is, how useful would it be to the readers in the other parts of the world to know this additional information? So this was really just, honestly, it's really just an internal dialogue from my end. And another internal dialogue is how to extend to the translation, the translated piece, the gender neutrality of the Filipino language. In the text, in the original text, the third person reference is not gendered. In relation, I tried to translate it that way by using the proper nouns rather than having to choose a pronoun he or she or they. This is pertaining to the datus, or the political leaders, the warriors, the blacksmith, who have always been presented as males in our history books. And so one could easily assume that way. However, in this essay, it was not explicitly mentioned in the first parts. What was highlighted instead was that the babaylans are often women, seldom men. This is interesting to note and something to appreciate as far as rethinking our history and how history is being presented. So these are just some of the stops and turns in my SEMENTÄ journey, and I look forward to sharing with you the final text. Lastly, Professor Mga has also committed to take a look at my translation, which I truly trust to be in the spirit of sisterhood and shared aspirations. So thank you again. Good day, good evening from here in the Philippines. Back to you, Iria.
Thank you very much, Daryl, for your presentation. So before we continue, I'd like to say that when the three participants finish their presentations, we will have a Q&A, and so you can make your comments and ask your questions. So please take this into account. I have thought about some questions already. So now I'm going to give the floor to Caridad Valcourt. She's a feminist activist from Haiti who studied at the State University of Haiti, and she specialized in community social work. And in the Women Farmers Association, she works with women's organizations, reflecting upon the living conditions in rural areas. She works in the field of women's health and the involvement of women in politics, and also in the gender-based violence. So Caridad is going to take the floor now. You may start, Caridad.
Oui, c'est bon, je suis là. Ok. Merci de ta présentation. Je suis très content d'être avec vous aujourd'hui.
Caridad, no conseguimos ver.
Ok.
Ahora sí.
D'accord. Donc, je suis très
Okay, thank you very much. I am really pleased to collaborate in this SEMENTÄ project, and it is a great adventure to me. And it joins us all together. I'd like to thank Maria. Thank you for thinking about me when you were preparing this event. I usually speak about different words, and about the women who live in southwest Haiti, and I work with women in a rural area, taking into account the economic violence and especially to accompany women, taking production into account. Women that are not usually academically trained, so we have to help them. So I chose this text because I think that it is interesting, current interesting analysis, because it deals with the different types of violence women suffer from, economic violence, which is at the core, and some other issues that women face. So now I will share my presentation with you.
Donc, j'ai fait une explication. Donc, c'est un texte normalement
This paper was written by Marie Mesnel,
français violence économique et femmes en
and it is called Economic Violence. It is at the core of this paper.
Donc, c'est dans le cadre d'un atelier
This paper was written around 1 year ago, the 25th of November 2020, in a workshop about violence against women. And it was written mainly on the basis of vulnerable women, most of them illiterate or with not much training in rural areas. In Jeremy, in the department of Grand Anse in Haiti, he was very honest. The goal was to accompany women, especially, and along all the stages of violence of society against women.
c'est le lien entre
It reflects upon the economic violence against women in rural areas in Haiti. We might say that this is the space where it happens for the most part, and also the feeling of insecurity that prevails all around the country. And that is why women think and reflect upon this kind of economic violence in the rural areas. And it really impacts women and families directly. So within this context of insecurity and economic violence, this text was written. So it is a very current text. The main theme is a discussion about economic violence, but this is related to many other concepts that are dealt with in this text. Other concepts such as juvenile crime, crime itself, sexual blackmail, successive polyandry. This means that a woman might be married to different men and have children. And it is an economic violence because she is forced to leave her children and to go away because they cannot make a living to be able to raise their children. In most cases, men are not responsible for those kids. And the sexual division of labor is also important. So you always need to be cautious. There are some aspects you need to take into account. The concepts are not really equivalent. In Creole, feminists do not always agree in some translations. And the Creole Academy of Haiti is too recent, too new. And they haven't dealt with these issues yet. That is why feminists are not unanimous in their decisions. In Haiti, we had to make sure we had to take into account different concepts and we shouldn't make word-by-word translation. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Caridad, for your presentation. Now we will have Professor Laura Damaris. She's an associate professor at Baratidasan University. She works in the English department, and she's been teaching for over 15 years. Right now, she teaches theory and critics, women's writing, Bakhtinian poetry, language, English language and literature, and Holocaust literature. And she's also active in the field of translation and comparative studies. Apart from that, she has published many articles. And now we give the floor to Laura. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Iria. Thank you. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Manimegle because she was the one who was spearheading this project, and she had, in fact, selected the text and passed it over to me to translate. So I'm also thankful to Maria for having included me in this project. I'm basically a teacher of English and also teach feminist theory criticism. And this text was really a very important text for me because this provided a very new perspective for me as well, because since I teach English literature, most of my feminist ideas were European or Western thought. But this was a very different way of looking at the feminist requirement. So the text that has been chosen is written by a person called Ms. Sivahami, who is, let me just share my screen. One second. Yeah. She is an IAS officer in the Indian system of job portals. Being an IAS officer, an Indian administrator, is one of the most coveted positions. She belongs to the listed classes, which are classed as so-called scheduled, or low. And when we enter into the land of education or jobs, these kind of classifications are very are unmissable. You cannot miss these classifications. And she has been working there for 29 years, but she had to quit. And she also writes and gives interviews. And she said it has always been a struggle for her, being inside the system and to fight for the women, and the least of these, especially Dalit women, had been a very hard struggle. And before her completion of her service, she quit her position so that she can come out and work better. And I think that has been a very wise choice, because she has become a prolific writer. She has written novels and many numerous articles in many languages of India, which has been translated. And her activism is multi-pronged. As I said, she is also a writer. She has also started a political party. She has floated a political party for a social cause, a social equality party. And in that way, she thought that she can make inroads, and she had been quite successful, not to the point of winning, but to have made their presence felt. This being said of the writer, because the writer brings with her experiences, as somebody said, not only the individual, but also the collective. I feel, the contextualization of translating this text is a big need. Firstly, I think I needed to get into this economic part of feminist writing because I am not used to that. So for me, it was a big a learning. So I had to go back to so many of my friends and to even know the terms. So it was a new area of research for me as well. I think I should thank Dr. Manimegle and Maria for introducing me into this. And there is a huge need for contextualization because as I started my presentation when introducing the writer, made a reference to Dalit. Dalit is a term which has to be understood in context for a non-Indian audience. And women are also initiated into the caste system. The caste system being so prevalent, though it is illegal, but still it is so prevalent. It is so rooted in the social and cultural fabric of Indian society that how Dalits and women are treated is something which has to be read through in all the writings, especially when it comes to translation. This socio-cultural spectrum has to be understood. So Dalits and patriarchy is a double bind. And because Dalits themselves are marginalized, they are deemed to be untouchable, though the untouchability is phased out to a large extent. But still, as we go through the text, we find that still landholding is a problem, and historical knowledge is also a colonial history of India is also required for us to contextualize this. And I'm just putting forth voicing my own concerns because there is a need for a huge contextualization, whether I should put it all in an introduction and or as footnotes, because there are so much which we have to explain. So this is something where I would need some help also. So about the text is actually about land ownership. And I will just give you the main points of this text. And she has titled the text as Woman, Land as the Breath and Speech of Women. The justification, we will find it at the end of it. But she starts with speaking about how land holding was happening in India from past years. Before colonial age came into being, the British colonization began. What was interesting even for me was the olden days, the classical days, the lands were divided according to the topography and no one really owned. The land belonged to the people. And later on also, the land was held by people. This was a word that she used, Nilamanyam, and I had trouble translating it because you don't have one equivalent word in English for that, because it is not about ownership at all. It is like nobody owns the land, but you are holding the land and you cannot sell the land. The land is not in your name, but you can use the produce of the land and you can gain the profit of the land, and you can also pass it on to the generation, but you cannot sell the land. So this was how it was. Land ownership was that. But later on, when the colonization began, there were a lot of land reforms, and the land ownership came into being. And people who had the advantage and the privilege, the so-called upper caste, they became landowners. And when they became landowners, later on they claimed that they are farming with the lands and they claimed subsidies from the government. But the land ownership was denied to Dalits and the ones who really work in the land. So this is the irony of the whole thing. The land did not belong to that people. So from here, the feminist perspective that Sivagami brings in is that, and this is the statement that she makes in her text, the starting point of women's emancipation is rooted in land. So she is arguing that land ownership is a concept which has to be rethought. And land should not be classed as an individual property, but as a life sustaining source. That land cannot be a commercial property which can be sold. And so this is a very, very radical departure, because when you look at India's makeup, 70% of the population are in farming. And sadly, those who really work in the fields, they do not have ownership over their lands, and they are perpetually in the state of being bonded labor. So she is looking at the past era, which has been almost an era of women's emancipation, where men and women, both of them, worked in the fields, and they had enough. And a land was the place which made the space, which gave them sustenance, which gave them the needs that they required for a happy and healthy living. And so this is where she brings our focus. So land as a place of emancipation. For me also, this was very challenging thought, where she brings in land as not as an individual property or as a collective property, but not to look at land as property, but to look at land as a life sustaining source. So there should be an entire paradigm shift to look at land as a giver, and not land as a property, as a deed. And not only that, when she also goes further on to say, if land is now considered as a life sustaining property, life sustaining source, then it becomes where there is cattle and forest resources will be protected. They will not be exploited for profit, because it doesn't belong to anybody. We all live, the land is for everybody, that we live with the land, and the resources are there, we exchange. And few people will not monopolize the land. So the corporatization will be not an issue. And also, she speaks about the absentee landlordism, because here we find lands being brought in troves by those who will not even come and visit their lands even once a year, but they have people to work in their farms. So this notion of ownership has to be turned right around the head. And where she speaks about land becomes a place where both men and women gather together to work, where they have men have work where they till the land, the harder work, and women, they plant and they harvest, they reap, and both of them, they also have jobs together. So she is speaking about a place where the land gives equal opportunity for working, and they both work. They don't have a role which is superior or an inferior roles, where they both work. And the problem with this is, and Sivagami not only stops with writing, she has also initiated many land struggle reforms. In fact, the land struggle reforms were initiated by Ambedkar himself many, many years ago. And she again has now, these are the challenges that she's still fighting, that women have to be given lands. You know, this is still a culture where women are not given property rights, even when the family is very wealthy. You know, I know a family where they have a huge tracts of lands. They have 6 daughters and 1 son, almost an entire village they have, but none of the daughters will get. So I was asking them, why don't you go take a legal recourse? They will not. They said, no, we will not anger our parents. So even though legally women have a right over the lands of their parents, but the tradition holds good, and women do not get their lands. And when they do not get lands, they are always a liability. And this is a big issue. This is where the dowry harassment happens, exploitation of women starts. So when women are given lands, you know, that is a place where, according to Sivagami, and the emancipation begins. Women with lands will turn around the servility and different forms of slavery they're subjected to. So they become land holders, the land holders who can live with dignity. So this is the text that I have chosen, and I'm still working on the translation. And this has also given me a very deep, an alternative point of view for me to think into the text, because for me, the economic perspective of feminism was not in my repertoire at all. So with this, I conclude my presentation.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Muy interesante también a tu presentación en esta parte.
Thank you very much. Laura, thank you for speaking about emancipation. It has been very interesting. So the three presentations are over, so now we're going to have some time for Q&A. If you have any comments or questions, the participants might ask questions. So if you want to write on the chat or just ask. Meanwhile, I have a question for you. And you have talked a bit about this, but this is something that is quite interesting to me. I believe that the translation work is very different because it is a translation that is bound to be intermediate. It's going to serve as a medium for the next translation. You have talked about the need for contextualization. You need to conduct extensive research to allow translators to be able to carry out their work. And Maria was talking about how in this case fluid discourse is not so important, but the practical sense of translation. So could you tell us something else about the main issues you found in this sense, and any specific explanations about how you solve those issues? Are you aware of the fact that this is an intermediate translation, and how are you solving that in practice? Maybe, I don't know, any of the three speakers, would you like to say something about this?
I didn't understand properly. If you were asking how will this link language, English being a link language, work, I was also like putting forth, my concerns. How should we make it outside the text as making a footnote or as a separate piece? That I think we really have to discuss and evolve, if that's what your question is about.
Sí, trátase de eso. Sí, cómo se resuelve, si a través.
Yes, how to solve it. And yes, sometimes you speak directly to translators on some occasions, not only through the footnotes, right?
Better, as you say. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Yes, I would agree with Laura on that. As an intermediate piece, for it to be translated into a non-hegemonic language, and then my concern also was where to put the explanation in terms of putting it in the footnote or in another text, for example, because it might also tamper on the original text, which has its own footnotes. So that's one thing. As for example, earlier I mentioned about the 1896 revolution in the text, but I had to explain, and that was not part actually of the original piece, but I had to say it in this conference, that it's referring to the revolution that sought to end the 300 years of Spanish colonization. So That's a question also from my end on where to put that or to place those explanations and extra information. That's why earlier I was also asking if there is a need to also explain the origin of the word babaylan as part of also of the own history of the term. But perhaps as Laura and as Iria you mentioned, a conversation or a separate that's discussion Q&A itself with the next translators would help as part of the understanding of the context.
Could I add something? Yes, can you hear me? Yes? Yes, I would like to explain, because I am the promoter of this project, that this process of dialogue is important, and it is a process that will continue to evolve, and we're still at the beginning of this project, but logically, a project of this kind requires collaboration. In this case, I'm going to be the person that will translate those intermediate texts, with the exception of crioulo, into Galician, so I will need to work with my colleagues as they continue. And I think that there is something quite interesting. You have the possibility to develop your own strategies, and the strategies for a language do not necessarily have to be the same for another language or for a specific text. So in that sense, I think that the framework of SEMENTÄ is quite wide, because very often when we receive texts that were translated into a non-hegemonic language into English, there are some mediations there that are invisible, and they can hinder the translation into another language. I'm going to give you an example that Laura will know very well. When we are working with a text that was translated from Tamil to English, to be read in English, you know that very often if there are references to the gods and goddess of Hindu, those gods and goddesses, instead of being named in Tamil, Hilliard or others, they appear in their Hinduized, standardized versions, the standard versions in English. I am translated into Galician, but I don't want those names of gods and goddesses have gone through the filter of the standardization of internal translation of names, because in Galician we don't know those Hindi gods and goddesses. So for us it is important to preserve the original name in Tamil. So those processes might take place, and SEMENTÄ wishes to prevent that. When we use an intermediate text, we don't have to be based on the standardization, so the colleagues that are translating could decide the aspects they want to explain or not, and we can establish those dialogues directly. They shouldn't be done for a US citizen. Very often this is not connected with us. Maria, the invitation has been received. Could you please make a small summary of what you just said? Because on the chat they could not hear your interpretation. Just to sum up, I was saying that within the framework of SEMENTÄ, this possibility of establishing a dialogue is real. We are just at the beginning of this project, but we have the chance to dialogue through these processes of translation individually and collectively amongst all of us. But it is important to understand that the strategies that are important for one language or for a specific text do not necessarily have to be the same for others. And I also talked about the fact that when we work with intermediate languages, sometimes we have some issues because they were not, they're only done for the translation process. So there is an invisibility in some cases. For example, I gave an example about how the names of gods and goddesses that might appear in an original text in Tamil, god and goddesses of Hinduism, like Vilayar or others, when those texts are translated into English, the original names are not preserved. They are Ganesha, or they are translated into the standardized Hindi versions, the names of gods and goddesses. So if you're going to translate that into Galician, it's not necessary to make this transition. We want to know the names that gods and goddesses have in Tamil. So that is why SEMENTÄ is important, because we can eliminate this invisibility that you get in the middle when you make translations, thinking about a final reader in French or English or Spanish, or in the US or in Great Britain, and they are not really connected with the contexts of our non-hegemonic languages. Okay, Maria, thank you very much. Anybody else has a question or comment? So I have a question for Maria. Just talking about Rosalía de Castro as an innovative writer. So could you please tell us about that, about these strategies that you mentioned before, those revolutionary strategies in this sector? Yes, sometimes we believe that decolonial feminist translation is quite recent, and these are strategies that we are using currently, and they are quite innovative. But when we began to study our past, and I hope this will be stimulating for colleagues from other language communities, we found out that there were women who translated and already applied strategies that would be considered as stimulating and feminist and decolonial. Just to give you a specific example, Rosalía de Castro is another, and well, Daryl knows her very well, and I am sure Caridad has heard me talking about that at some point. Rosalía de Castro is the founder of our literature, this writer from the 19th century. And she also did some translation. And after studying the translations she did, you can clearly see that when she translates texts by a man from Spanish to Galician, she changes, for example, man, when he is talking about a poet, he translates that as a man, but when the original poet uses man as referred to human being, Rosalía de Castro never translates this as man. She always uses other words to refer to a whole community of people. And she also did some risky interventions in some texts. Another was speaking about Galicia in a pejorative way. And he felt sorry for Galicia. He was quite arrogant, and in her translations she totally destroys that content, and she changes the tone of those poems. So it is very interesting not just to translate but also to conduct research, and I think that what the translators have been doing throughout history in our language communities. We found this example, but I'm sure there will be many others in other places that need to be researched into, because women are not much studied as authors, much less as translators. So researchers have a big responsibility there. Thank you very much, Maria. There's a comment on the chat by Mani Mekalai. And maybe the panelists or Maria wishes to comment upon that. Translation into non-hegemonic language would help to formulate feminist theories of local contexts and get rid of often referring to the Western feminist thought. Do you have any comments? More questions?
Yes, just to comment on Manimeli's comment. I couldn't agree more because I think the text that I really shared with you all is really a statement or an assertion of local feminist theory that is indigenous to the Philippines and really counters the general notion that all feminist theories are from Western concepts. Although, in terms of from the perspective of the movement, these are not being pit together, not necessarily being put together, but really to look at the contribution of all theories to the experiences and the struggles of the women in our respective countries, or in our country in particular. And but now that I've been listening as well to our discussion, I tried to reflect again on the question that I raised earlier in my own sharing on whether there should be additional information as regards the term babaylan in itself. Now I realize that as we discuss non-hegemonic languages, even within inside countries, there are hegemonic language too. Like for instance, in our country, it's the Filipino or the Tagalog language, which is very representative of the center of power in the country. But then again, the term babaylan is not necessarily from this center of power. So now I would try to answer my own question that it is necessary contribution to also add that information that the term, the context of the babaylan as a feminist thought and the word that it originated from also came from the non-hegemonic languages or cultures within our own country. So it is a necessary information. Would you agree, Iria?
Sí, de acuerdo, muy.
Yes, I agree, and it's very interesting. Maybe the other panelists wish to take the floor and make an additional comment, or maybe the participants. Would you like to say something else? Okay, then, if you will, we can call it the day. And I think that Maria wanted to say goodbye before the end of the session. Yes, I just wanted to thank you for your presence. Of course, I'd like to thank our colleagues Dari, Laura, Caridad. Thank you for being part of this project, and thank you for the work you have ahead. I'd like to thank Iria for being the chair, and I'd like to thank the interpreters and the technical team. So I just want to encourage you to continue taking steps at SEMENTÄ. We still have some work to do, and we hope to be able to keep on discussing with the texts and the translations, and we hope these discussions will grow outside Galicia, outside the language community of Galicia. And with this cross-pollination, we hope they will get to the other colleagues in this project. And that's it. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'd like to thank you all for your participation, and thank you for carrying out this interesting project. I'd like to thank the participants and the audience and the organizers of this session, and I'd like to thank the interpreters as well. Have a good afternoon.
Yeah, we will see. Thank you. Bye.